Hi everyone, welcome to the Achieving Community Resilience Through Microgrids webinar from the NARUC-NASEO Microgrid State Working Group. We're really excited about this webinar. We heard from a lot of you that this was a topic that was near and dear to your hearts. So we're excited to have 3 speakers joining us from California this time to talk about resilience and how microgrids can enable resilience in the state, but also more broadly in other states. We will have an hour discussion. First, we have the 3 speakers and then Q&A, and then we will have a members-only discussion following from 4 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Dominic, if you'd like to advance the slides, please. And before we begin, I'm really excited to announce that we've released the 2 briefing papers that you've all heard so much about already. Both jointly authored by NASEO and NARUC, and especially thanks to Kira and Sam from NARUC and NASEO, who've been the lead authors and who put a lot of time and effort into these 2 papers. So thank you so much, and thank you for all of you who had a chance to review them. We definitely appreciated your comments and have integrated them. The first paper is on the user objectives and design approaches for microgrids on options for delivering reliability and resilience, clean energy, energy savings, and other priorities. I'm using the Durkheim model to look at how those kind of goals can be achieved through microgrids. And the second is on private, state, and federal funding and financing options to enable resilient, affordable, and clean microgrids, looking at what kind of private and public financing options there are to support microgrid development across the US. You can view the press releases. The press releases went out just shortly before this webinar, and all of the reports and executive summaries are available on the NASEO and NARUC website for you to review. So thank you again to Kira and Sam for spearheading this. Next slide, please. So with that, we're going to turn to our 3 speakers. We have first up Mike Ravelli. He's the Research Program Manager from the California Energy Commission. His office is managing over 300 million in microgrid energy storage and related energy research and communications projects. And his team oversees over 30 active microgrid research projects that represent a full spectrum of field application of microgrids, including critical facilities, key community emergency response operations, military operations, and supporting the needs of the state's underserved communities. He'll be followed by Jana Gagnon. She's the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director of the Blue Lake Rancheria, a federally recognized tribe in California. And in her role for the Blue Lake Rancheria tribal government, Jana helps create strategies for decarbonized resilience. And her development experience includes strategic planning expertise, hazard mitigation, emergency preparedness, economic development. And she's also currently the co-chair of the U.S. Department of Energy's Indian Country Energy and Infrastructure Working Group. And then followed by, Jana will be followed by Craig. Craig Lewis is the Executive Director of the Clean Coalition. He has over 30 years of experience in the renewables, wireless, semiconductor, and banking industries. He was previously the Vice President of Government Relations at Greenvolts, where he was the first to successfully navigate a solar project through California's Renewable Portfolio Standard solicitation process. I think we have an excellent lineup of speakers, so I'm going to go get out of the way. If you have any questions, we will take questions at the end of the presentations. But please feel free to type them into the chat box as we go along, and then we will turn to them at the end. So with that, Mike, the floor is yours.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry, a little bit mixed up there. So again, Mike Gregley from the California Energy Commission. Just in general, the commission is about 700 people. Our R&D division is who I work for and have worked for 18 years, is about 100 staff. And I'm just going to give a quick overview of what we do and then focus into all the microgrids that we were involved in. We have over a decade experience in working with microgrids, and I'll kind of cover that in the presentation. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with the California Energy Commission and the programs we manage, I work under what's called the Electric Program Investment Charge, where we just finished 9 years of that program, and we just got approval last year for 10 additional years. We receive about $130 to $140 million a year in research funding across the full spectrum. So we do basically projects. Our ultimate goal is to commercialize projects and to make them bring California more solutions. And so we do everything from early stage to full maturity, but we don't do basic research, really early laboratory research, and we don't do much. Once it's commercial, we leave it to the commercial market. We try and move technologies into the commercial market. Next chart. So as I mentioned, we have a long history in microgrids. In the early days when we did microgrids, we were looking at just connecting solar and storage and generators to the grid and being able to switch back and forth and not shut down the customer and not shut down the grid. So a lot of it was just basically configuration. In 2015, we awarded 7 grants to do very good scale microgrids. I'll talk about a few of those, and Jana will be talking about her microgrid. She was one of the awardees in that round. In 2018, we awarded another 9 grants. When I say we, just our office. I'll talk about the commission. So we have several offices that are using microgrids. And what's happening now, when you look at energy efficiency, when you look at resiliency, reliability, and other things, microgrids are becoming a solution that's popular with a lot of customers. So in general, we've gone through the full spectrum, and now a lot of our focus now on microgrids is better understanding the application and better understanding the business model. Again, our ultimate goal is to get microgrids into a position where they're commercially valuable, and also able to answer questions, so that there's not so much research as there is implementation. Next chart. So this is just a quick show you that some of the projects we have right now that we manage out of our office, they're all through the state. What we do track is disadvantaged and underserved communities, in our case under-resourced, which is low-income disadvantaged on Native American tribes. And also we look at wildfire areas. A lot of times we look for projects when we had the recent 2 years of very extensive wildfires in California and heat waves and heat storms. We found out that microgrids could be very effective in those areas. So it doesn't cover the whole state, but it covers critical areas from those areas. So right now, most of the people that are interested in microgrids are interested for the ability of reliability and resiliency, for example, as opposed to using a microgrid to make money by selling grid services. Next chart, please. So we have a diverse portfolio from small microgrids into what we say medium size. So we're looking at less than a megawatt, a few megawatts, into larger ones, which are 5 or bigger megawatts. So we do have different ones, and the bigger they are, typically the more complex they are, but more customers they serve. So a community scale versus a single, maybe industrial facility would be an example of the different types of. We've looked at the full electrical configuration, or whether we do AC coupled, DC coupled. We've looked at microgrids that export to the grid, microgrids that just serve their customer, and microgrids that want to do both. They're basically 3 models that we run into. When I mentioned business models, when you try and come up with a plan to say, what's a microgrid going to cost? What's the value going to give you? And you can decide whether it's worth going down that path. So most of our microgrids are end user microgrids. In other words, so the customer is the prime recipient for our grants. And again, all of these are awarded through competitive grants. And as you mentioned, we've got somewhere in a range now of about $160 million invested between commission funds and match funds in microgrids. A third-party grant is typically a power purchase agreement. We have a couple examples of those. That's becoming what I say is a new approach that seems to be popular. So it takes a 10, 15, 20-year financial window. And so the customers that are investing in grants don't have to put all that money up front. If you look at the early grants we had, and even some of the later ones, most of the customers will tell you, and our grants have gone from anywhere from $1 to $3 million to $5 million to as much as $10 million now. So most of the customers will tell you without the public funds, the CEC funds, they probably would not have done a microgrid. But certainly it changes their business case when they have that grant to able to help them cover the cost of the renewables and storage and controllers and other things. There are utility scale microgrids, and we have a couple examples of those that we're working, but that's something that utility does direct. So in our case, we don't, they do that themselves, and we don't necessarily, they have their own EPIC program, for example, in addition to our EPIC program. So we partner with them, and we share with them, but there's only a couple cases where we actually have provided grants from our EPIC fund to the utility, and we have done that a couple times for special cases. Next chart, please. So as I mentioned before, we have a very diverse portfolio, and later in the question and answers, or even afterwards, you can reach out to me if you have questions. So critical facilities are the ones that seem to have the highest priority. It's just your definition of critical facilities. Medical facilities that need to operate during contingency environments. We have fire stations, police stations, and other things that provide community services. We have areas that provide service to the military, the Coast Guard. We have water treatment facilities that have to provide clear water to the area. So those are examples of critical facilities that we have or are doing microgrids with. The ports of California, we have 2 ports that are doing microgrids. We have 3 military bases that are looking at microgrids to evaluate their resiliency. Several communities, whether it be a small community or a college or a campus, there's microgrids in military, and prison facilities also, and things like that. And then the industrial complex. We have done examples where we've done an industrial facility, and in one case we did a DC architecture where the whole microgrid was DC versus AC to evaluate the benefit of that particular architecture. So we have had the full spectrum of those types. Next chart. So I'm just going to go through a couple examples. So Blue Lake Rancheria, which you will hear about from Janice, I'm not going to say much. It was one of our awards in 2015, a very successful microgrid. Blue Lake actually has a smaller microgrid at one of their facilities in addition to the larger one. It involves energy storage, and they have the ability to isolate from the grid for a certain number of hours. They were very successful in supporting us in the recent heat waves and firestorms that we had last summer. And also they have a Red Cross facility, they have a hotel facility, they provided all kinds of services. I'm going to leave that for Janet to define, but I would say it's a great example of a community microgrid and how it's supported. In this case, it's supporting a Native American tribe and the people around it. And so I'll leave it to Janet, but this is a good example, and it continues to be a good example of where a microgrid can provide value to the community, not just the facilities. Next chart. So we also awarded microgrid to a fire station, 3 fire stations in Fremont, and put in smaller scale. These are hundreds of kilowatts versus megawatts of scale. We did 3 fire stations in the first 2015. We also awarded another one in 2018 for 9 more fire stations and community stations. And so this is an example of a power purchase agreement. In this case, Gridscape works out a power purchase agreement 10 to 15 to 20 years with the city or the institution and works that. So this is an environment where they're providing, one of the lessons we learned, for example, in this case here, fire stations have to have diesel backup to protect them during contingencies, and they have to have 72 hours. What they run into is when if they have a contingency like they've had with earthquakes and other problems, and the 72 hours is exceeded, they have a real hard time purchasing diesel fuel because the time they need it, everybody else is looking for it, and it's hard to get. The fire marshal at one of these stations pointed out one of the biggest values they found from the microgrid was their ability to control their energy, and they could take that 7 days of diesel and only need to run it it would last them 7 or more days. So they wouldn't have to run the diesel continually because they had the storage in their solar. So what it did for them was it allowed them to back off on their diesel support. Obviously for us, that's one of the goals we want, is to get to the point where our microgrid can operate without diesel backup as long as the customer needs it. But it was a good example to show how you could use today's microgrids and actually modulate the amount of diesel fuel you would need and make that fuel last longer. And that gives that fire station much more time to resupply their fuel when it gets low. Next chart. This one here is the Red Coast. This is an example of a CCA and a utility, a PGA and the CCA we work with. They are developing a special tariff. In this case, the microgrid operates normally under the CCA, but when they have to isolate an island, the PG&E takes over the microgrid and runs it. So they're working a partnership between the utility and the CCA. This one also has, to support to the Coast Guard. that provides emergency services during these contingency events, so they're able to continue to operate. This is also an example where they have almost 20 different customers that are their customers under this microgrid. So we're looking at a lot. This one is doing the most creative work in developing rates and tariffs to demonstrate how a microgrid can be a profitable operation for the utility and for the end customer. Next chart. So the other one we have two of these right now. We're doing the virtual power plant. This is a big community scale microgrid, and they have a large variety. So they have different communities. They're putting in solar, they're putting in storage. This is an example of where they're looking at two different types of storage. They're looking at lithium-ion batteries in the home, and they're looking at flywheels, amber kinetics, and they're trying to determine on the performance basis and response time and long-term life, what's the difference in those two different technologies and how do they compare? So how does non-lithium-ion technologies compare in these applications? The ultimate goal is to make this community secure and then provide services to the community. And when they have excess and they can provide it, then they'll provide services to the grid, to the larger grid, to help the larger grid if there's times. And in some cases, they may just be a power plant to provide services for a fee. So this is a good example. They have, as I mentioned, they have the community. So they have schools, they have residential areas, and they have community centers. So this is an example of a larger community getting together and deciding that they want more control of their energy. So they're developing a microgrid that in fact becomes a virtual power plant. Next chart. And the last topic is just energy storage. Almost, well, all of our microgrids that we have, like the 60 microgrids that we have, all have energy storage. The large percentage of them have lithium-ion batteries, typically 4 hours or less. We've begun to award longer duration storage. We did some microgrids last summer that we awarded that will have 10 to 20 hours of storage. And in the summer of 2021, we've announced our plan to come out with the opportunity to do microgrids that have 24 to 36 hours of protection. So one of the things we're learning on microgrids is most of the systems would like a longer duration, and our computer analysis tells us if you can make it through the first 24 hours, then there's you're in a few percentages of when you'll have a problem that goes beyond that. So we're looking at that and we are looking at microgrids in the future that could have energy storage. There's energy storage we're working on that's developmental that could provide 100 hours of storage for the price of 4 hours today. So there's some real opportunity in the future. That's 5 to 10 years out, but it's clearly we have two different technologies that are trying to do that. And so there are opportunities for these microgrids to have multi-day support instead of the multi-hour support. And so with that, next chart, I think it'll wrap it up. And again, I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the question and answer session. I'm happy to answer questions by email or by phone if you need to in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristen for the other speakers.
Thank you, Mike. Before we do that, can I ask you just one quick clarifying question that we received? And that was, what is the dividing line between a large community microgrid and a public utility?
So that's a challenge we're working right now. I think the issue becomes, in my mind, when we say a large community, the community that wants to do this, and like I said, in the case of the Redwood, we're actually doing that, but we're doing it with the utility as a partner. In the case of Lancaster, we're doing it with the TCA as a partner, but it's not with the utility. So I think what I would say in general is that when you start talking about residential and commercial together and a cohesive group, that's a community. Typically speaking, 10, 20, 30 facilities or, 50, 100 homes into two different communities. So I would say if you're just under one single service, that's probably just a single microgrid. But when you get to different areas where you have a network that's reaching a broader scale, and most of our community scale include residential, commercial, and community operations. So I think it's a matter of how that community defines herself. An electrical load, we're talking about still small megawatts. So we're talking about, 3, 4, 5 megawatts, not 50 or 100 megawatts. So we're still talking about a scale that would be, 100 homes or 5 or 10 buildings. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And with that, we'll turn it over to Jana.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I just want to take a quick recognition that many of us are managing issues and maybe some pain associated with the worst of the COVID-19 surge so far. And that makes our time today even more valuable. On this slide is my email address. If there are questions or comments that we can address in this presentation or this session, please feel free to email me. Next slide, please. So first, a sense of place. I join you from the ancestral territory of the Wiyot people. The Blue Lake Rancheria is located in Northwest California, about 5 miles inland from the Pacific coast in a rural and geographically isolated region. Despite its small size and turbulent history, the tribe today is one of the largest employers in the region, and more germane to our discussion. In 2013, it formed a small tribal utility authority for certain infrastructure initiatives. Next slide, please. So microgrids are included in the tribe's infrastructure investment plan and strategy, which has the climate crisis at its core. It's been effective for us to re-examine typical vulnerabilities through a climate crisis lens to better understand the mix of solutions we need from here forward. As one example, the melt from this long list, the melt of the Greenland ice sheet is likely unstoppable now and contains about 20 feet of global sea level rise within it. Issues on the ground include more frequent and longer duration utility outages, power, telecommunications, both planned and unplanned. And the California grid's once in 35-year stress events happened twice in 2 weeks in September of 2020. Also in the last year, many of us have had to manage the worst wildfires and hazardous air quality that we've ever seen. Next slide, please. And because all of this has an economic component too, this is a graphic from NOAA published this week. In 2020, the US experienced its highest rate of billion-dollar disasters from climate and weather ever. A sizable portion of that damage was to infrastructure, including utilities. Next slide, please. And what we're finding is that more typical issues that we're all used to dealing with in our various regions, one at a time, are now stacking up and cascading. So nuisance power outages are common, but more frequent and for longer duration is now what we're seeing. In August of September 2020, historic heat waves hit the entire Western United States simultaneously. And this caused enormous grid stress in California and elsewhere, limited our ability to import power from other states. And so California had a few rolling outages to compensate. The tribe was able to island our microgrids to ease stress on the grid in those events and help limit outages elsewhere. Public safety power shutoffs, or PSPS events, as we fondly refer to them, are planned outages to prevent wildfires from the electrical grid. These are necessary. They're projected to last from 2 to 10 days or longer, depending on the damage to the grid in each event, and may be needed for the next decade. Next slide, please. So in addition to climate issues, our region also has serious earthquake and tsunami risk. We're one of the few areas that can expect a magnitude 9 or greater event at some point. Of course, that point is unknown. Next slide, please. And everybody's regions has its own, quirks. This one has tenuous connections to larger energy grids. There's one 10-inch natural gas pipeline that supplies both the region for natural gas and the Anchor 163 megawatt natural gas power plant. Electricity comes in by one 115 kilovolt transmission line. Both the pipeline and the transmission lines are vulnerable to seismic and landslide issues and run through high wildfire risk country. Humboldt has the fastest sea level rise on the Pacific coast, and the natural gas plant is right on the bay with an adjacent nuclear waste repository, and both are vulnerable to earthquake and tsunami. And then added to that, groundwater intrusion has been studied relative to sea level rise and is predicted to inundate the natural gas power plant site in a few short decades. So regionally, we're planning grid and infrastructure redesign and relocation now through efforts such as we're talking about today: distributed generation, distributed storage, microgrids, grid segmentation, and big power generation like offshore wind. Next slide, please. So to mitigate all these conditions, as we've heard, the tribe is building climate smart infrastructure as fast as possible. We use lowest carbon emission solutions to drive toward our goal of zero net carbon emissions by 2030, so that we don't make the underlying climate problem worse as we're trying to deal with the issues it's causing. The tribe focuses on lifeline sectors: energy, water, food, transportation, and communications. And it started with energy because, of course, that supports all the other lifelines. Social benefits obviously result from sound infrastructure. The tribe has reduced costs by over $200,000 a year, reduced greenhouse gases by 200 tons a year or more. We've increased expertise and capacity in the region. We've created new jobs and economic activity for the tribe and elsewhere. And we've managed to reduce pollution a bit in our community, contributing to better health outcomes. Next slide, please. So, as Mike mentioned, with strategic planning partners and strategic technology and implementation partners, the tribe has developed 3 electric microgrids. 2 are in operation, one at the community scale and one at the facility scale. And these have been supported by the EPIC program, as Mike mentioned. The CEC's thought leadership and their R&D investment has made all the difference in proving up these systems and really taking them from the whiteboard into the real world and figuring out how they work. By having one location for several microgrids of different scales and applications, we can also conduct research into load management, demand response, ways to incorporate more solar and battery storage, contribute to resource adequacy, and possibly help the larger grid avoid capital expense by reducing the need for upgrades to the distribution system as we do all this reorganization. Next slide, please. I won't go into technical detail here, but it's here if you want to refer back. All our microgrids are solar and storage backbone and can operate either grid connected or islanded. We do include diesel generators as those machines predate the microgrid builds, but we're working to phase them out and replace them with other generation and storage as fast as possible. These innovations are the result of extraordinary partnerships with the Schatz Energy Research Center, Humboldt State University, the CPUC, CEC, national labs, state and federal agencies, technology companies, our regional utility PG&E, and many others. The microgrids themselves provide a much improved backbone for both business as usual and emergency response, and for all the decarbonization we still need to do. We need to electrify transportation, and we need to electrify our buildings, and the microgrid can support all of that. The community scale microgrid detailed on this slide supports also a Red Cross shelter in times of need, and now a COVID testing site. Next slide, please. These are the details of our other microgrid in operation, our facility scale version called Solar Plus. So built again by an extraordinary partnership led by the Schatz Energy Research Center. This one powers our fuel station and convenience store complex and electric vehicle charging stations. It demonstrates a replicable, low carbon, quote unquote, resilience package for small to medium commercial buildings. And why a fuel station? Well, in emergencies, especially in rural areas, gas stations can provide, and many are the only public source of all the lifeline sectors, but they can only do that if they have power. So the photo at the bottom left is of people lining up to buy gas after a hurricane on the East Coast. There were entire cities that didn't have one functioning gas station because they didn't have power. And by shifting the power supply to solar and battery storage, we can have confidence in our free on-time deliveries of sun fuel every day. And that combined with storage and an energy efficient building, aggressive load management, and other operational advancements, these facilities can operate much more resiliently in all kinds of situations. Next slide, please. So as one specific example, I'm going to talk about the PSPS event, the first one in 2019. Because it was the first, our region was unprepared. The tribe had its microgrids though, and when the larger grid went down, the microgrids islanded and kept the power up. And because we were one of the only locations with functioning services, we served a good portion of the county, the general public, the business community, and importantly, emergency response agencies for 30 hours straight from one small central campus. One of the most important functions was to supply lodging in the hotel for people who needed powered medical equipment. The tribe was credited with saving 4 lives in this event by the Department of Human Services locally, but all the services that were provided and the supplies delivered were important. At the heart of microgrids and community resilience is this idea of operational flexibility. In normal, non-emergency, business as usual situations, certain facilities will have one use. Then when disasters hit, they can be repurposed to serve emergency response. The tribe's event center became an American Red Cross shelter. Hotel rooms became critical care units. The gas station prioritized and served emergency response agencies. Electric vehicle charging kept electric buses and vehicles charged so that people had access to transportation. Restaurant refrigerators kept tribal members' medicines cold. Meeting rooms became clean air shelters, places people could recover from wildfire smoke inhalation. And the list goes on. When I last spoke with NARUC members years ago, one commissioner commented that they'd never really thought of casinos as emergency shelters. Now, a few years later, that's what happens in many times over in the wildfire events and other disasters. Many tribes have come to the rescue of their regions in this way. Next slide, please. So the outages were relatively short because of a lot of hard work by a lot of people, but they did do their share of disruption and damage. And one of the issues they highlighted was the interdependence of energy and telecom. When the power went out, telecommunications followed at about the 24-hour mark, and really it was unacceptable. Lack of internet and cellular connectivity impacts emergency communication and limits the telemetry and SCADA control of the electrical grid itself. Telecom is a public utility alongside energy now, and it's past time to enact regulation to ensure continuity of service delivery in emergencies as a starting point. And we need to use clean energy to do it. We can't continue to roll out diesel generators. Next slide, please. So this is a dense slide, and I'm almost finished, but it boils down to a few lessons learned from building microgrids. One, given that microgrids benefit stack accrues to the site and grid in non-emergency operation, and then to a larger region in emergencies, we need to take these two value propositions and use them to design and de-silo funding and regulation, programs, rates, other supports as we move forward. Microgrids will make sense, as Mike was mentioning, for certain sites, keeping in mind that to a large degree they will always be custom. And an example of this is portions of tribal nations in California and Alaska and elsewhere have never had grid access. So standalone microgrids are now a viable option in those areas, particularly where stringing transmission lines is dangerous and wildly expensive. We do need standardization where we can achieve it. Microgrid tariffs, interconnection agreement details, appropriate technology, maybe standardization of point of connection switchgear for increased safety. All of these things can and should be standardized to a degree to reduce costs and improve operational benefit. Microgrids achieve the most benefit if they can operate in coordination with a larger grid to ease grid stress. So it's important to think about nested microgrids within larger grid segments. It's also important, particularly in rural, remote environments, to think about capacity and expertise. Depending on their design, microgrids can be as complex to run as any electrical grid, so building local capacity alongside microgrids is crucial. And then grid segmentation may offer a flexible architecture to coordinate transmission and delivery. A larger electrical loop affords ability to attach larger generation and storage assets. We can achieve economies of scale and lower capital and O&M costs. PG&E, who's a valued partner in our projects and a thought leader in these areas, has piloted several grid islands that are a starting point for these kinds of reorganizations. Next step, please. So Finally, in my role with the DOE, I get to work with 573 federally recognized tribal nations across the country and states and the federal government. Tribal governments are increasing their jurisdictional and operational control of utilities that serve their nations and communities. Tribes will be increasingly assuming utility commission roles and portfolios, rate setting, policies, programs, all of which we've talked about today. Tribes will be building more community scale and utility scale clean distributed energy resources. So figuring out ways that we can all coordinate at that tribal, state, and federal triangle is super important. And then, the recommendation really is to create forums to collaborate at the regulatory level. The need is there for regional tribal utility commissions to work with their state utility commission counterparts on mutually beneficial structures that work to do what we all want, improve community resilience. And so on the next slide, I've included some links in case people want to explore further. But thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jana. And one quick clarifying question for you too before we turn it to Craig. There was a question, is there a tariff that charges customers beyond the geographic barriers of the microgrid for the larger benefit that the microgrid provides?
Not that I'm aware of related to microgrids, although I know that a lot of people are working on this. So there are a lot of resources that could answer that question. I just am not up on those latest details.
Great, perfect. And maybe that's something we can explore through the working group. So with that, we'll turn it over to Craig. Craig, the floor is yours.
Super. Well, I'll just add on to the answer there to the question. The Redwood Coast Airport microgrid that Mike mentioned and highlighted in his presentation is working on community microgrid tariffs, and it is the very best example, certainly in California, of making progress towards having broad community microgrid tariffs in place. I sit on the technical advisory committee of that project, and I just received an update this morning, and there is significant progress being made on tariffs for community microgrids. The place to look is in that in the Redwood Coast Airport microgrid project referred to as RCAM, and my contact details are shown here on this slide, so people are welcome to reach out to me, and I can provide updates on everything I'm going to talk about plus RCAM as helpful. I'm going to try to bring together this concept of value of resilience, particularly from solar microgrids. The Clean Coalition has been working to standardize value of resilience, and we have a methodology we've developed called Value of Resilience 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 comes from tiering loads into 3 tiers, with tier 1 being the most critical, tier 2 being priority, and tier 3 being completely discretionary. And obviously those loads have different values, and you need to give them different levels of resilience accordingly. Jana did a great job of talking about the need to standardize certain elements of solar microgrids and microgrids in general. And one of the places that needs to be standardized is valuing resilience. For example, we're talking to municipalities, utilities, individual facilities all the time, and everybody that you talk to about resilience, if you ask them the question, is there value to indefinite resilience to your most critical loads? The answer is obviously yes. The corollary to that question, though, is what's the value? And people shrug. They don't know. They don't know how to value resilience, and therefore, typically, the value that's given is 0, and that's ridiculous. So I'm going to be talking about the value of resilience is really the core theme that I'm going to be talking about here, and I will be going into some I'll detail the value of resilience 1, 2, 3 methodology, and then I will go into a couple of Clean Coalition examples that basically put the VOR 1, 2, 3 methodology into context, into actual projects that the Clean Coalition is facilitating. So let's see, moving on to let's see, slide 2. Okay, here we go. So many of the members of the audience here are probably not familiar with the Clean Coalition. We are a nonprofit entity. Our mission in life is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. And our end game vision is that we will get to 100% renewable energy. It's just a matter of when. Will that happen in 10 years? Will it happen in 30 years, or somewhere in between? But it will happen in that scale. And when we get there, the Clean Coalition believes that at least 25% of the energy mix needs to be coming from local renewables, because you need local renewables to optimize your economics, environmental benefits, and resilience. You cannot get resilience from generation assets that are a long distance away and have to travel over transmission. By definition, long supply lines are not resilient. Okay, so let's see, moving on to the next slide. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not controlling the slides. That's why my keys aren't working. So the VOR 123 methodology yields a value of resilience for a typical solar microgrid scenario that is worth a 25% adder to the electricity bill, the annual electricity bill. So let me first just repeat that the VOR 123 starts with load tiering. So when you think about your loads, you need to park them either in a tier 1, which means these are critical. They're life-sustaining, mission-critical loads. They cannot go out ever. And if they go out, it's basically equivalent to somebody dying. Tier 2 loads, these are priority loads. You'll want to keep them on as long as you can do so without threatening the ability to keep your tier 1s on. And tier 3 loads are totally discretionary. You will keep them on if you have plenty of energy available. For example, if you've got a solar microgrid and you're basically either going to turn down your solar because you're spilling solar, and if you're islanded, there's no grid to pass it back to. Or if you're in a community microgrid and you're islanded from the broader grid and you're keeping 100% of your needs and you still have extra solar, you have to basically turn off some solar. So if you're in that mode, you should keep on 100% of your loads. Tier 1 loads, they have to be maintained 100% of the time. The typical facility is going to have about 10% of its load is going to be tier 1. The tier 2 loads, the typical facility is going to have about 15% of its load is going to be tier 2. And that means you can keep it on about 80% of the time in a standard solar microgrid configuration with California solar resource quality. And then the tier 3 loads, you'll be able to keep those on for about 25% of the time as well in a standard California configuration. Yeah, next slide, please. And this chart basically looks at the standard California solar microgrid scenario, at least the standard that the Clean Coalition would design to. And basically the standard is that you have enough solar to net zero the site, and then you put for every 100 kilowatts of solar that you put 200 kilowatt hours of energy storage. And if you do that, if you size the solar microgrid in that configuration, you will keep your tier 1 loads on, or at least 10% of your load on 100% of the time. That will never go out. You'll keep an additional 15% of your load on, the tier 2s, at least 80% of the time, and you'll keep the rest of your loads on at least 25% of the time. This chart, I've seen it a million times, so it makes perfect sense to me. You've got percentage of load on the vertical axis and percentage of time on the horizontal axis. These slides will be made available, I think, through NARUC, and they'll be on the Clean Coalition website as well. So you'll be able to study this slide if you want to at your leisure. But let's go to the next slide. I'm going to run out of time, so I need to go a little bit quickly. I just want to make the point that diesel generators are not resilient for a lot of the reasons that came up in Mike's presentation as well as Jana's. That diesel has a limited lifetime. The typical diesel generator has 2 days of fuel supply on hand. So a typical diesel generator is shown, the amount of resilience you get from a typical diesel generator is shown in this red hatched rectangle in the diagram here. That basically means you keep 25% of the load on. Diesels are typically sized for tier 1 and tier 2 loads, and they'll keep them on for 2 days. That's your standard diesel generator configuration. So it's a very small percentage of the overall resilience compared to a solar microgrid, as you can easily see from this diagram. Next slide, please. I also want to caution people, you know, while we're talking about fossil fuels, I just want to caution people that natural gas is not a resilience solution either. The picture here is from the San Bruno natural gas pipeline explosion that took out an entire neighborhood, killed multiple people. That was about 5 miles away from the Clean Coalition's Menlo Park office. So that was really meaningful to me. What people don't realize is that accidents like that, like the San Bruno accident, they happen several times a year, about once every 2 to 3 months in the United States. The only reason you don't hear about them is they're so frequent, you only hear about the ones that are basically in your community. There's also been a lot of studies that show the restoration time. When there's a major earthquake, for example, in San Francisco, all of your utilities go down. Natural gas, electricity, water, communications, everything goes down. So then the question is, how long does it take to get back? And electricity gets back about 30 times faster than natural gas does, and which is shown in the diagram to the right. Next slide, please. So valuing resilience, as I said before, we put all of the Clean Coalition analysis has shown that the value of resilience from a solar microgrid is worth a 25% adder to the electricity bill. We have verified this and validated the 25% premium on 4 different pathways. First of all, cost of service. This is basically the way the utility business works, right? How much does it cost to implement something? Let's pass that cost on to the ratepayers, right? It's just whatever it costs plus a little profit built in and distribute that cost across to ratepayers. Cost of service, typical approach. It shows that the value of a solar microgrid from a resilience standpoint based on cost of service is right in that 25% ballpark for a small solar microgrid. Large ones, you get the resilience for free, as I'll show you in some coming examples. But small, I'm talking small scale, probably like the scale that Jana talked about with the gas station and the food mart. At that scale, you're going to need about a 25% premium in order for that to be cost effective. In other words, that gas station owner would need to realize they need to pay a 25% premium to get this amazing level of resilience for their facility. We also used an approach that we call the DOE multiplier. The Department of Energy has done a lot of, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on trying to value resilience and standardize it. They always fail because they take different approaches depending on what type of facility they're talking about. The Clean Coalition approach normalizes across every facility. It doesn't matter whether you talk about a hospital or a fire station or anything in between. The value of resilience is standard for a tier 1. It means people are going to die if you can't keep that tier 1 load on. Tier 2, same thing, it's going to be standard value. In tier 3, the only difference between facilities is what percentage of their load is tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Hospital, they have about 50% of the load is tier 1. Fire station, 10% of their load is more than tier 1 because their dispatch center and their fuel pump, those are really the only tier 1 loads that exist at a fire station. Next slide, please. We also looked at market-based. So we just looked at solar microgrids that exist already in the market to see what premium is being paid for, for the solar microgrid that they've got. This is an example from a company, an organization called Direct Relief. They provide emergency medical supplies to disaster-stricken areas all around the world. They've got a solar microgrid in place, a bunch of solar on the roof, as you can see. They've got a battery that follows about the 2 times for every kilowatt of solar. They've got 2 kilowatt hours of energy storage. They follow that VOR 123 solar microgrid sizing. And they have about a 30%, about a 25 to 30% premium that they're paying for their electricity in order to have that level of resilience. Next slide, please. And the last approach is the one that most people would probably want to start with, and that is what's the avoided cost of a diesel generator? And so we've gone through and we've created a diesel calculator that is also available on the Clean Coalition website for free. You can go in and change the assumptions and play around with it. But basically, we've come up with a typical solar microgrids facility. If you did it with a diesel approach instead, you would have a 21% adder to your cost of electricity. So the solar microgrid adder at 25% and the diesel, the cost of a diesel approach is going to be, in that same neighborhood, 20 to 25%. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try to put some of this VOR 1, 2, 3 methodology into context. I'm going to start by describing the Goleta Load Pocket. The Goleta Load Pocket is a area of southern central California around the city of Santa Barbara. It incorporates a 70-mile stretch of California coastline that is all served by a single point of interconnection to the transmission system. And that point of interconnection is through the Goleta substation, which you can see in the middle of this map. And that single point of interconnection is served by a single transmission path that's 40 miles long through extreme fire, landslide, and earthquake risk. So the Goleta Load Pocket is hugely vulnerable to transmission grid outages. And Southern California Edison, which is the prevailing utility here, they have said that that transmission line does go down, will go down, and could be down for months at a time. It's through treacherous mountainous terrain. It's not easy to repair those transmission towers when they go down. We've done the math. We know that we've got 2 magic numbers to provide 100% resilience to this region from transmission outages, and that is adding 200 megawatts of additional solar, 400 megawatt hours of additional energy storage, and we got the magic numbers. We will not have to worry about that transmission outage. And I will just say the 400 megawatt hours, even though it's a much bigger number, I want to just point out that it follows the 2-to-1 ratio, right? 200 megawatts of solar, 400 megawatt hours of energy storage. The 400 megawatt hours of energy storage is going to be a lot easier to achieve because there's already 280 megawatt hours that's been approved for coming online within the Goleta Load Pocket by the end of this year. The 200 megawatts of solar is much stickier, much harder, and we need lots of policy innovation from the California Energy Commission, from the CPUC, from other bodies to make sure we've got procurement mechanisms that can get a boatload of additional solar into the Goleta Load Pocket and everywhere else for that matter. Those policies do not exist, and we can't do it through net metering alone. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to drill down a little bit on the Goleta Load Pocket. It has 8 66 kV feeders that serve it. This one in particular is really critical. It serves UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara is right in the middle of it, that green splotch area. Also the Santa Barbara Airport. Direct relief, I showed you a little slide about their solar microgrid is in this load pocket right here. And I'm going to just show you one more slide on it. Next slide. This is a, next slide, please. This is a block diagram of it. And one of those, I mentioned those 280 megawatt hours of energy storage coming to the Goleta Load Pocket. 160 megawatt hours of it is right there in the middle. That battery is there and can provide the grid forming requirement if you island and turn this into a community microgrid. So there's this amazing opportunity to make a community microgrid out of this area. Next slide, please. And very quickly, I can tell Kristen's getting on because she's going to rush me off, so I'm going to go really fast. This is the Santa Barbara Unified School District. It's got 21 sites. We just got unanimous approval last night to do 6 solar microgrids across this Santa Barbara Unified School District. They will be online in the summertime. Next slide, please. This is the sites of the 6 solar microgrids. They're by design spread out throughout the Santa Barbara Unified School District service territory because we want to make sure we've got opportunities for people to shelter close to where they live. Here's the beautiful thing. The Santa Barbara Unified is going to save almost $8 million in guaranteed bill savings from these projects, and they're going to get almost the equivalent value for free in resilience value. They're going to get $6.5 million in resilience value for free. Next slide. Okay, last, I just want to mention this project real quickly. Valencia Gardens Energy Storage Project. This is also a project funded by the California Energy Commission. Thank you very much, Mike. And it's got a bunch of solar on top of a apartment complex that serves low income and senior populations. This is a diagram of the Valencia Gardens Energy Storage Project. We have a whole bunch of solar there already. Our project, the Clean Coastal Project, is to add energy storage to it. And our goal, immediate goal, is to show that we can basically enhance the interconnection hosting capacity of the feeder. The feeder is completely full of solar already, so we're going to be able to add a whole bunch more solar because of adding this battery into the picture. But I do want to point out that very simply, with the addition of a grid isolation switch, which is shown there in red, with the addition of that grid isolation switch, we can turn this into a true community microgrid that's serving hundreds of residents of the Valencia Gardens apartments, which are seniors and low-income tenants. With that, I will pass it over, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Greg. And we got a lot of questions. One is a clarifying question for you that we'll just start off with, and then there are a few questions that we have for all of the panelists. So one of the clarifying questions for you, Craig, was, does the 100 kV photovoltaic 200 kilowatt hour ratio allow for garnering 100% of the ITC?
Yes, well, the ITC is determined by, it allows you 100% of your SGIP, your self-generation incentive program, for those of you who play in California. That's important. And then also the investment tax credit, the ITC. Absolutely. In order to get 100% of the ITC, you have to charge your battery 100% from the solar. And for sure, the typical capacity factor for solar in California is about 20%. So basically, you get about five hours of sun a day, average day across the year. So you got 2 hours of energy storage, essentially. It only takes you 2 hours to charge that battery from 0 to 100%.
Great, thank you for that clarification. So for all the panelists, and you can see on the screen, if you haven't answered or asked a question, feel free to type it into the question box or raise your hand to be unmuted. We have about a few more minutes. We go a little past the hour for questions, but we got a question in. One of the audience members said they heard that some microgrids allow the incorporation of existing newer diesel generations, but not existing older diesel generations. If anybody of the panelists could provide any specifics about that.
I think that's a false, at least in California.
Well, so there's regulatory frameworks for that, but I don't know if the question is about regulation or technologies. From the technology side, we had one a megawatt older diesel generator of about, I don't know, 2000 vintage, plenty of lifetime left on it, and so we incorporated it into our first microgrid, which we built several years ago. And we had to do some integration because the controls on that diesel generator, pardon me, the controls on that diesel generator did not play well with the microgrid control system. So we had to do some technical integration. And now, for certain uses and in certain cases, diesel generators are certainly frowned upon, if not quite yet banned altogether. But we anticipate that might be coming.
Great, thank you for that answer. And then another question came in. Are there any examples that any of the panelists know of renewable natural gas powered prime mover microgrids? We heard that natural gas from the emission side is seen critically. So are there any examples of renewable natural gas?
I don't see a big difference between renewable natural gas and natural gas when it comes to a microgrid, because you're either, if that's coming over the pipeline, you're still vulnerable to the pipeline. If it's through an anaerobic digester and you're storing it on site, then you actually have a local story there, which makes it a lot better than a pipeline natural gas story. But most renewable natural gas is coming over the pipeline. It's just injected, and in fact, you're not actually getting renewable natural gas electrons, or molecules. You're just getting it's just a contractual arrangement.
So I can add a little bit there from my EPIC side. We actually have a legislative restriction from funding fossil fuel systems, diesel and natural gas and gas. So we are looking at microgrids that rely on, so they rely on hydrogen, renewable natural gas and hydrogen kind of come together if it's green hydrogen. So yeah, we are looking at that. We are looking at hydrogen. We're looking at fuel cells that generate hydrogen, but do it through electrolysis, so it's a green system. Today, they're a little more expensive than the alternatives, but we are doing research. We awarded 3 hydrogen energy storage projects that are required to use green hydrogen, and so we're starting to assess that. So when you look at the future of natural gas and the future of hydrogen, we do believe that hydrogen, both as a fuel for replacing diesel and also hydrogen fuel cells can do that. The biggest difference, if you're not aware of fuel cells, when you put a fuel cell with a microgrid, is typically the fuel cell is the power source and the grid is a backup. So it's not just a backup power system, it is the power system. So there's a pretty big change in structure when you do a fuel cell with a microgrid.
Hey, thank you so much. With that, thank you for all the questions. Thank you so much, the panelists, Jana, Mike, Greg, that was amazing. We will have the slide deck is downloadable, but we will also share it with the working group. So we have all your contact information, because we didn't get to all the amazing questions, but we're kind of at the end of the hour and don't want to keep you. Thank you also so much to the Department of Energy, which is supporting the microgrids working group and has been supporting this webinar. With that, I invite the members of the NARUC-NASEO microgrid working group to stay online for our half-hour members only portion. And everybody else, thank you so much for participating. And again, thank you to our panelists.